A recurring storytelling device in Better Call Saul is using flashbacks from the characters' childhoods to show the kinds of decisions that they make as adults. This storytelling device was used for Chuck and Jimmy to show the influence their upbringing had on their relationship to each other and their relationship to the law, while Kim's flashback shows her relationship to her mother and her descent into crime at an early age. One of the first things to notice about Jimmy and Chuck's flashbacks is how little presence their parents had in it. Chuck almost functions as a faux parental figure considering the age gap between him and Jimmy. And what little we saw of Jimmy's father is that he was kind of a pushover. Something that would influence the kind of people Jimmy would take advantage of. This also tells us something about how far Chuck's resentment goes. Because there's years worth of things that Jimmy would get away with. And with two enabling parents, Chuck seemed to be the only one putting out Jimmy's fires. And the only thing we really get to see of their mother is on her deathbed. She's in the hospital with Chuck and her last words were Jimmy. The only person who heard her say this was Chuck, and Jimmy completely missed it. To make things worse, Chuck being the son who was there didn't seem to matter to her as much. We see a similar struggle for attention for the woman who had become his ex-wife. When Jimmy meets her for the first time, he's making her laugh, but when Chuck tries to, it doesn't even register as a joke. When Jimmy finally does show up to the hospital and asks Chuck if she had any last words and Chuck says no, we're not entirely sure how much of this was Chuck trying to protect Jimmy's feelings and how much of this was him refusing to admit Jimmy was the favorite. In either case, Chuck's underlining resentment towards Jimmy, as well as his disappointment with his inattentive parents, all fester in his decisions later in the series. The interesting thing about Chuck taking Jimmy to court is that they would be more punitive towards him than their parents were, almost like his adult version of telling on Jimmy to his parents. But this time with an objective third party who wouldn't be easily swayed by his humor. But when this doesn't work and Jimmy turns the tables on him, Chuck's tone changes from a professional one to an adolescent one. The heart of Chuck's problem is his inattentive parents. Him stepping in as a parental figure to Jimmy largely went unnoticed and nobody was looking after him. We see him doing things like reading a bedtime story to Jimmy and doing things you typically see a parent do. Yet Jimmy's charisma would be praised while Chuck stepping in was seen as the bare minimum, something he was just expected to do. So his inattentive parents affected his relationship with Jimmy in two ways. On a personal note, he was envious that they didn't pay attention to him in the same way. On a responsible note, he noticed the unhealthy amount of attention they paid to Jimmy and the way he took advantage of them, the same way he would take advantage of the law. Nobody had a clearer image of Jimmy than Chuck did, but again it goes unnoticed because of Jimmy. And Jimmy, the child of inattentive parents, doesn't recognize discipline as constructive, only antagonistic. So while Chuck's childish side comes out when his feelings get dismissed, Jimmy's comes out when he fails to receive approval. Even after Chuck's death, his specter looms over Jimmy. You can see this during Jimmy's suspension when he struggles to be reinstated. His inability to bring up Chuck is part of the reason why he came off as so insincere. And his lashing out after the fact is because this recalls back to Chuck's last words. The reinstatement hearing is essentially Chuck all over again. Even Chuck's last advice that he should give up the charade and embrace the bad person that he is works out well for him, manipulating everybody at the appeal hearing. He ends up persuading everybody, including Kim, how sincere he is, only to reveal that this is all a game to him. Jimmy's unresolved childhood comes in the form of constantly needing emotional support. He seems to be accustomed to being coddled, and when close loved ones like Chuck didn't give him validation, he lashes out. Even more so after Chuck's last words that Jimmy never mattered all that much to him. Chuck's death only furthered his codependence on Kim, and any disapproval she had of his actions he didn't know how to handle. Same with the reinstatement hearing that's now playing as a surrogate parental figure. But when he found a way to scam them, their approval no longer mattered. He didn't respect them anymore. And in this case, we can see why Chuck was needed in his life. It's a want versus need issue. He wants people to approve of his actions, but he needs people to hold him accountable. It's no coincidence that the two major people in his life are people he needs to constantly persuade. It's also no coincidence that he tries to get both of them to roll around in the dirt with him, as he says, and brings them down to his level. I do believe that's how he became the Saul we see in Breaking Bad. After he and Kim divorced, he had no one else in his life that he cared about as much as he cared for her. And you can see his humane side return to him in the second to last episode. It's not often that people trust Saul Goodman, but as Gene he had a clean slate, and realizing that he broke another person's trust, he had to confront his guilt for the first time in years. And that explains a lot about Chuck and Jimmy's relationship to authority. Neither one of them is accustomed to having that kind of stability at home, and Chuck being deprived of it made him double down on it when he got into law. The result of Chuck being overlooked by his parents his whole life not only led to him having resentment for Jimmy, but would also lead to him latching onto something where his sense of responsibility was rewarded. So of course he would gatekeep it when Jimmy got involved. Of course Jimmy isn't aware of this, he just wants to follow in Chuck's footsteps. And with his criminal past, he thought going into law would make Chuck proud of him. And Chuck was happy for him to turn his life around, but him having that kind of power and influence was too reminiscent of the very thing Chuck was trying to get away from. And of course, Jimmy saw an opportunity to turn his life around and get the law to like him. There's an element of his criminal ways that weren't malicious. It was just all he knew how to do. He was a pretty decent lawyer, but he was really good at dishonesty. And of course, he would gravitate towards anybody who would encourage or reward that kind of behavior. And that brings us to Kim. Kim has some of the most sparing backstory throughout the series. Her backstory is intentionally kept vague, with us not being able to get a good read on what her motivations are until later on in the series. Because of this, we only get 2 flashbacks with her. Kim plays an interesting role in the series, where she is the focal point for a lot of the exposition the audience receives on Jimmy's backstory. It's through Kim's eyes that Chuck tells the story of Jimmy stealing money out of their father's business for years, and when he died shortly after, no one cried harder at the funeral than Jimmy did. It's through Kim's eyes that we see Jimmy and Chuck's deteriorating relationship and the reasons why Chuck doesn't trust him. We see 2 flashbacks with Kim, both of which involve her mother. The first shows Kim waiting for her mom to pick her up from band practice. She shows up late smelling like alcohol, so Kim chooses to walk home instead. The second shows Kim getting caught stealing. Her mom manipulates the guy to go easy on her, then later rewards Kim with the necklace she originally stole to reward her for getting away with it. The first flashback plays at the beginning of the episode when she suggests getting married after telling Jimmy she couldn't trust him. And the second flashback plays at the beginning of the episode when she makes the self-destructive decision to take down Howard. The more that we learn about Kim and her backstory, the more it becomes revealed that she's the perfect enabler for Jimmy. She grew up having to play the adult in her relationship with her mother, but was also enabled by her mother when she was caught committing a crime. Also, notice the parallel between Kim and Chuck, both having to play adults way too early in their lives, and trying to recreate the structure they didn't have in their childhood as adults. One of the things to notice about Kim, even by her own peers, is how professional she is. She's well respected by her clients and maintains a reputation of being trustworthy. But every once in a while, just like with Jimmy, she eventually lets the mask slip and portrays unprofessional behavior. She raises her voice at her boss in the middle of the office. She gets an attitude with a client. And she trespasses on someone's property when an argument between the two becomes personal during an eviction dispute. The part that makes her more like Chuck, though, is how protective she is of her image. She does make conscious choices to separate her relationship with Jimmy with her professional life, such as trying to have separate practices or separate offices, leading to insecurities in their relationship. But while this conflict led to her straddling the fence between creating structure in her adult life and reliving her lack of structure in her childhood life with Jimmy, we eventually see where her values lie, and she ultimately shows that she doesn't respect this structure after all, prioritizing her relationship with Jimmy over her career. And this whole dichotomy is her childhood. On the one hand, growing up, admiring Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird, and on the other hand, wanting a partner in crime that resembles her relationship with her mother. Which is fitting because she almost has a mother-child relationship with Jimmy, holding him accountable when it matters, and also being his partner in crime, to the confusion of her peers, who sees her relationship with Jimmy as beneath her, which is a testament to how well she's hidden her past. Only problem is her relationship with Jimmy couldn't sustain until they continued to do crimes together, because crime strengthening her relationship with Jimmy is like crime strengthening her relationship with her mom, as shown in the second flashback, but unfortunately it became like a drug that she couldn't stop, progressively committing worse crimes until she does one that's irreversible. And we can see how this challenges Kim's moral code. We can see her trying to justify taking down Howard as having moral benefits to it, trying to separate it from her stealing from the store when she was a kid, even though that's all this is. Stealing from a store is a petty crime, but putting an enemy at the center of it can justify some terrible things, and Jimmy and Kim have mutual reason to despise Howard. Howard and Chuck both uphold the structure that Jimmy and Kim have spent their whole childhoods not respecting. Figures such as Chuck and Howard are just rule followers that are in their way. It's a clear pattern that a lot of the victims in this show are the elderly. Chuck was significantly older than Jimmy, and so is Marion, played by Carol Burnett, and so were the elder law clients Jimmy had. Just like how Breaking Bad would use the harming of children to show Walt's declining humanity as a father. Better Call Saul uses the harming of the elderly, typically people his parents' age, to show Jimmy's declining morality as a lawyer. The black and white storyline plays as a kind of purgatory. For years of the both of them avoiding adulthood, adulthood now seems to punish them by sticking them in dead-end situations with no real future ahead of them. Kim's fate is self-imposed while Jimmy's is the result of his own actions. It's only fitting that his new partner in crime is a grown man still living with his mother. It's also fitting that he's manipulating another elderly woman. The point where he really starts to change is his phone call with Kim. The first thing to notice about this phone call is that the consequence of Jimmy shutting down his humanity after Kim left is that he has a very faulty memory of what their relationship used to be, thinking that she called him to see if he was still getting away with it and not just out of concern to see if he was still alive. And of course having an outburst when she holds him accountable, because this is a thing he hasn't been accustomed to in a long time. But he is eventually reminded of what it's like to care what someone thinks of him, and he does make one last gesture to display turning over a new leaf with her as an audience. The buzzing of the exit sign is also a reminder of Chuck. The law did end up taking down Jimmy the way Chuck wanted it to. So what the story is telling us as the story concludes is that while Chuck was unable to reconcile with his childhood, Jimmy and Kim eventually did by taking responsibility for themselves. The thing that Jimmy, Kim, and Chuck all had in common is that their childhoods affected their ability to find their place in the world. Chuck developed a lot of self-isolation from years of not confronting his issues with his family, so after his failed marriage, he devoted all his energy into his career. Once his unresolved baggage with Jimmy and his isolation habits led to a falling out between him and Howard, he ended up going into an early retirement, and he had nothing left to live for. Kim had a lot of promise in her career, but with her complicated relationship with her mother and her desperate need to hide her past, she naturally gravitated to people like Jimmy, which thwarted her career ambition and led her down a self-destructive path. Jimmy, who's used to coping with the consequences of his own actions by believing they will always go away, he's now stuck in a life where he can't do that anymore, but refuses to come to grips with that. So both Jimmy and Kim's storyline end with self-punishment, Kim living a mundane life and Jimmy turning himself in.